and gentlemen, it's my pleasure on behalf of the University and the Institute of Conflict Analysis and Resolution to welcome you to the 6th Annual Vernon M. and Minnie I. Lynch Lecture. It gives me particularly great pleasure to welcome Ed and Helen Lynch to this gathering. I think there's really no need to introduce either of them to the ICAR community. It's well known that they have long been supporters, indeed from the very beginning of the history of our institution. They've long been supporters of the work. Is that better? Right. Louder and funnier. Just you wait till you get up here. It's well known that Ed and Helen have been great supporters of the institution and its works over the years, and indeed they were here for the very first occasion on which the Lynch Lecture was given by our late friend and colleague Jim Lowry. I mention this because one of the things we've managed to do over the last couple of months, partly in memorial to Jim, partly to complete the set, is to produce as an occasional paper Jim Lowry's first Lynch Lecture, which took place in the summer of 1987. This year we're sort of proud and privileged to have a lecture given by an old friend and colleague, both of the Institute and of the Lowrys, Roger Wilkins. I'm not going to say anything at all about Roger because that task falls to my friend Rich Rubenstein, and I don't particularly want to sort of undercut him. And so I will merely conclude my last speech of the day by saying to everybody, but particularly to Ed and Helen, welcome to the lecture. And I now call upon Richard to introduce our speaker for this evening.
Thank you, Chris. That was the shortest speech you've ever made, I think. In Europe, it's not so unusual to discover, and I'm not really sure why, men and women who are politically active, who are writers, who sometimes work for government, who do journalism, who write important books, and who are artists, all at the same time. In the United States, it's harder to discover figures like this. But one such person is here to speak to us tonight. I think no matter how old you get, you sort of go through life looking for role models. And I know that for me, an ambition, kind of wild ambition, you might say, has always been to do a number of things well, to find a certain amount of personal fulfillment in doing them, and to develop myself, and at the same time to make a contribution to the cause of social justice. Roger Wilkins has somehow managed to do it all. And for that reason, he's a role model for me, and I think for a lot of other people at George Mason and not at George Mason. Roger started out as a lawyer, as some of us others have done, working in commercial law in New York City, and this is having already graduated from Michigan with an AB and JD. And he went from the private practice of law into public law in a major way, initially in the Kennedy and then in the Johnson administrations, where he was first working for the Agency for International Development, then was with the U.S. Community Relations Service in its earliest phases, a point at which he got to know Jim Lowry and to work with Jim. Then became Assistant Attorney General of the United States, working for the Department of Justice in the late 60s. All of this taking place from the late 50s into the late 60s in one of the stormiest times and one of the most transformative times in the United States government. But he didn't remain in government. Following 1969, he went into philanthropy, working at first for the Ford Foundation as program officer in charge of social development, then assistant to the president of the Ford Foundation. And following that, that stage of his career, he went into journalism, working for the Washington Post, as a member of the editorial page staff, the New York Times, as a member of the editorial board and a columnist in the 70s, and then for the Washington Star, for those of us who remember that. And at the same time became interested in radio and television. Was a network radio commentator for CBS News in the early 80s, worked for the Mutual Broadcasting System as a commentator in the mid-80s, and has been with NPR as a radio commentator since the 90s. With all of this activity, Roger found time to write and has written some quite remarkable books. One of them is called A Man's Life, which James Baldwin called a most beautiful book, which it is. Dennis's book is selling pretty well back there, but Roger's, I have to tell you, is doing, I think, even better. He also wrote a book I have used in classes at George Mason called Quiet Riots, which he did with Fred Harris. And he has also done work for Mother Jones magazine, done frontline commentaries and other media work. But all of this really, in a way, skirts the surface of Roger's career. Roger has functioned as a government servant, as a journalist, as a writer, as an artist, and underneath it all is the project of social change. Roger has never forgotten that society is changed by people with a vision and people with determination and people with practical skill, all of which he has in abundance. And so he has done things which I couldn't even begin to summarize in a short introduction, but which have involved such things as advising Jesse Jackson as a senior advisor in 2 presidential campaigns, as being a national coordinator of Nelson Mandela's 1990 visit to the United States, being on the board of the University of the District of Columbia and the boards of directors of the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law, working arduously for the New York Civil Liberties Union, and finally coming to George Mason, where he was Distinguished Faculty Member of the Year in 1990-91. All of these talents he brings here, and at the same time continues his important and creative relationship with the Institute for Policy Studies in downtown Washington. Karl Marx once said that in the wonderful society of the future that he envisioned, people would have a chance to have lots of careers. Marx said there was no reason why people couldn't be a streetcar operator in the morning and a farmer in the afternoon and an artist at night. Well, Wilkins has somehow done it all. He's achieved great success personally in all of the careers that I've just mentioned. But most important, he's kept his eye on the main task at hand, which is to make a society substantially different from the one that we have now, a society where conflicts can be resolved nonviolently, a society where equality and justice are the rule, are the norm, and not just a paper norm. Roger has given me inspiration not only because of all the things that he's done well, but because he hasn't given up. There's every reason to give up when you look at what the world looks like today, when you look at what the United States looks like today, when you look at what the cities look like today. There's every reason to say, well, it's been a good try, but it didn't work. It's been a good try, but I quit. It's been a good try, but maybe in 100 years or 200 years, things will be better. Roger doesn't think that. He thinks things can be better quicker than that. He thinks that if people like you and me do something about it, things will be better quicker than that. And God bless him for it, because I haven't given up either, thanks to people like Roger Wilkins. Roger?
Rich, thank you very much. That was overly generous, but I liked it. Chris, Ed and Helen Lynch, colleagues, friends. I'm really glad to be here tonight, which is a weird thing for a faculty member to say on a Friday night, but I'm glad to be back at George Mason tonight. But as Rich was talking, I was transported from the George Mason campus back home to Grand Rapids, Michigan, where I went a few years ago to receive an award which moved me very much. It's always really nice to get an award at home, where they know you. And so they said all these nice things about me. And then I got up and I was introduced, had been introduced very much the way Rich just introduced me. And I stood up. My mother was sitting at a table right in the front. She was then in her early 80s. And you black people in the audience, you know what we think about our mothers. Mothers are important to black boys, and it doesn't matter if you're 58 or 59 years old, as I was then, your mama is important. And I got up, and mama was looking like a storm cloud. So I started my speech, and mama looked like a storm cloud. So I raised the level of my game. Mama still looked like a storm cloud. I got a couple of, interruptions for applause. Mama still looked like a storm cloud. I finished the speech. People gave me a standing ovation. Mama still looked like a storm cloud. I got off that thing. I went down. I said, Mama, what is wrong with you? She said, oh, that introduction. I said, what is wrong with the introduction? She said, it sounds like you can't hold a job. Something to that, too. Tonight, my friend and double colleague, Jim Lowry, is very, very much on my mind. You might have seen me carry this up to the podium. Usually, when I speak, I just put something in my pocket and I pull it out, talk with it. But this thing looks kind of official and formal, but I brought it because of Jim. But when Jim came to work with us at the Community Relations Service, I gave him a lot of grief about being a Harvard guy. What can a Harvard guy know about anything? It's tough down there in the South, Jim. That's not a place for Harvard boys. And on and on and on and on. Matter of fact, the last time I gave him grief about being a Harvard guy, he was getting me to make this lecture. It was Chris and I were standing with Jim in the commencement line. And Jim had on his Harvard robes. And boy, I was giving it to him. I gave it to him a couple of good times. And my wife went to Harvard. And finally, I said, you know, Jim, you wearing that thing? You look like my wife. For the first time in 25 years, I knew that guy. He did not have an answer. He just looked funny. So this thing says, Veritas, RWW, in gratitude for service to Harvard. And at some stage, I had meant to show this to Jim and say, see, even good guys can go wrong. So in honor of Jim, I brought this thing along. And he was the first Lynch lecturer. He was my colleague in the 60s when there was, for a moment, there was extraordinary promise in the American air. Jim is alive in my heart and head a lot, and surely right now, with a smile on his face, looking at me, and his brain and his spirit at work in his words, explaining and exhorting and amusing. And Jim and I, a white guy and a black guy, and some other black people and white people, in a small agency in the U.S. government in the 60s, when the cities were being ripped apart, had hopes that the American city would be renewed as a place of great justice and democracy. The promise for the cities in the 60s was that America had taken an honest look at its racial history. The country was rich then and growing and vital. Some people thought that America had experienced a profound change of heart and that justice could be purchased with our bountiful growth. We were then experiencing a continual period of low inflation, low unemployment, and steadily inclining gross national product. And I remember one day I was upbraided after I had given a speech by a man who said, "We will have justice in America. America is never a zero-sum game. We will always grow. We always have. We always will. And out of our bounty, we will have justice." Well, unfortunately, it did not turn out that way. Some of us had strong suspicions, Jim and I and Wally Warfield among them, that there was less promise and more foreboding in our 60s experiences. For the things that we had seen in the cities all across the country, I had profound doubts that the humane trajectory of the early 60s could be sustained in the cauldrons of despair deep in our inner cities. There was too much animosity toward the people there. There was too much poverty. There was too much human devastation. And there was too little will and money to be marshaled against those things. So I left the federal government in almost exactly 25 years ago, lacking 1 month, making the same warnings in speech after speech, in public appearance after public appearance. And they were essentially two warnings. One, if we do not change our national investment patterns, our cities will become blacker and poorer, and that will be a disaster for our nation. Secondly, if we continue to treat people like savages, they will become savages, and raising groups of savages in the middle of the central points of growth and renewal of a culture is a wonderful way for a civilization to commit suicide. Now, 25 years later, the forebodings have clearly outdistanced the promise. One would have to be a fool to say that we have not experienced unbelievable racial progress in the United States over the last 60 or 70 years. I surely cannot say that we have not made progress. I was born 61.5 years ago in a segregated hospital. I started my education in a one-room segregated schoolhouse. My father is buried in a segregated cemetery. He was a brilliant man, one of the only man I have ever known who read Shakespeare just for pleasure. And yet when he died in 1941, he was not good enough to lie dead with white people. And he never, with a powerful mind and a great spirit and a wonderful sense of humor, could transcend the segregated life to which he was consigned. He never worked for anything but a black publication in a black part of Kansas City, Missouri. My father could not, on his deathbed in 1941, have imagined Colin Powell. Could not have imagined the success that has come to Oprah Winfrey or Toni Morrison. Could not have imagined as a journalist that his little boy would someday be the chair of the Pulitzer Prize Board. So I do not tell you that America has not changed and that progress has not occurred. It has. What I tell you, however, is that in the 60s, when I worked with Wally Warfield and with Jim Lowry, I went to virtually every riot there was from Watts in '65 to the riots that occurred after Dr. King's death all over this country. And in the ensuing 25 years, I have seen what has happened to American cities. They have become blacker and poorer. I don't know of a single American city that I knew in 1968, 67, 66, or 69 that is not a worse place to live now than it was back then. I live in basically the same neighborhood right around the corner from where I lived in 1966, 67, 68, and 69. I like my neighborhood. There are poor people, there are rich people. There are senators, and there are people on food stamps. I like my neighborhood. I never wanted my children to grow up not seeing the whole range of humanity, including poor black people. And so my little girl, who is 10 years old, is seeing the same kinds of people that my older children saw, and is developing the same kind of empathy that I wanted them to have and that they do have as adults. But this week, a woman was raped 3 doors down from where we live. That did not happen in the 60s. Three, 4, 5 times a year, there's a murder within a half of a mile of our house. That did not happen in the 60s. People have alarms on their houses and bars. That did not happen. There are guards in the Safeway. I pay for that with the price of the grapefruit. Life is coarser and more difficult. We are fearful now. Well, what happened? It seems to me that our history caught up with us and bit off our dream. And our history is very powerful. I see one of my students here, so he will remember this arithmetic. The first written, recorded history of Africans on the North American continent occurred in August 1619. We've had 374 years of contact between Africans and North America. In that 374 years, 2/3 of it was slavery. Think of it. In that 374 years, 2/3 of it, 246 years was slavery. Another 100 years was semi-slavery and constitutionalized racial subordination. That's 346 out of 374 years. We've only had 28 years of something else than slavery or constitutionalized racial subordination, and that 28 years has not been equality. It has been something other than those other things. And there are two very powerful forces in that history. One is that the souls of white folks had settled fully and comfortably into the privileges of whiteness. The privileges of whiteness, there are lots of them. Economic privileges, sexual privileges, psychological privileges, the psychological privilege of knowing that you can never fall below the state, as low as the state of a black person. The second force is the revulsion about black people and profound doubts about our human capacity. There is a third force, and that is the damage. Those two forces are the damage that our history has done to white people, but the final force is the damage it has done to black people, and that damage is enormous. But as a result of that history, as a result of the white American embrace of racial privilege, we got the politics of resentment about the threats to white privilege that the 60s posed. 3 phrases will give you snapshots of the politics of resentment: law and order, forced busing, reverse discrimination. They were buttressed by their allies: crime in the streets, welfare queen, Willie Horton. The race card was played in Southern elections for years and years and years before the 60s. The Southern politicians did it promiscuously. It was not done in the North. We thought it was a Southern thing, that only those barbarians in the South riled up their rednecks in their wool hats that way. George Wallace in his 68 and 72 campaigns showed Northerners that the race card could be played in Michigan and Colorado and California. So now both parties play it in national elections. Both parties. It's a bipartisan game now. George Bush had Willie Horton. Bill Clinton had Sister Souljah. Same game. Same game. Bill Clinton, slicker, smoother, talked about welfare and crime. He was not talking to black people, welfare and crime. He was not talking to black people about welfare and crime. I got off the subway during the campaign in Bethesda, Maryland. White lady handed me a flyer. Said, "Are you a Democrat?" I said, "Yes." Handed me a flyer, put it in my hand. Said, "Bill Clinton and Al Gore on welfare and crime." Well, I did not know that welfare and crime were problems in Bethesda, Maryland. I did not know that. And I read the welfare and crime program of Bill Clinton, put out by the Kensington, Maryland Democrat. You know where Kensington is? I ain't got no welfare in Kensington. And precious little crime. But the Clinton campaign was designed to get the votes of people in Kensington, Maryland, and Fairfax, Virginia. To do that, you had to play the race card, and they did. Wasn't as crude as welfare queen, as Reagan's welfare queen, or Bush's Willie Horton, but it was the race card. So now, in the 80s and 90s, as opposed to the 60s when the national government was preaching to us and teaching us that racism was bad, we must purge ourselves of our ancient evil. We now have, from our national leaders, winks and nods. Had all that, and then on top of that, the bottom of the economy fell apart. From 1973 on, the economy stagnated, and from the people at the bottom, there was disaster. According to MIT economics professor Lester Thoreau, former dean of the Sloan School of Management at MIT, from 73 to 92, the bottom 60% of male workers' income dropped 20%. For unskilled blacks who didn't drop out of the economy, the drop in income was 40%. But hundreds of thousands, perhaps better than 1 million, dropped out. The unemployment rate for black males since the 70s has never dropped below 10%. During the 80s, it averaged 13%. Those economic figures, economic facts, have had hideous results in terms of crime and family disintegration. And they're occurring at the same time the federal government was reducing its share of city budgets from 18% in 1980 to 6% in 1992. So now there is a conservative, neoconservative, new Democrat assault on the black poor. They're no longer said to be inferior. It's now said that it's their behavior that's abhorrent. So the president preaches personal responsibility to them. And all of this reminds me of the words that George Bernard Shaw wrote in Man and Superman, in which he said, "The haughty American nation forces the Negro to shine his shoes and then disdains him because he is a bootblack." People fall apart under economic stress. Every time we have a recession, we read stories in the newspaper about how white people who lose their jobs begin to drink heavily, begin to take drugs, begin to abuse their wives, begin to abuse their children, begin to commit suicide, and begin to have great divorces. Well, black America has been in a depression for the last 20 years. So of course there are people who are behaving very, very badly. Well, what to do about all this? Because there are savages loose in our cities. There are children having children. There is social disintegration. What to do? I was busy developing a strategy that exhorted the country to a program called Repairing the Black Family. Step one was to put black parents, particularly, back to work. And I had it all sketched out, made speeches about it. And I could have made this speech about it tonight. Then the full implications of the NAFTA debate hit me. Let me go back to Lester Thoreau's words. Between 1973 and 1992, the bottom 60% of male workers in America lost 20% of their income. We're not talking about black people now. We're talking about white people. We are talking about 60% of the male workers in this country. Thoreau went on to write, to put it bluntly, the American political process has lost sight of the economic well-being of the bottom 60% of its workforce. That is a very powerful and damning statement. The political process has lost sight of the economic well-being of the bottom 60% of its workforce. And he goes on to point out that Clinton pitched his campaign at these people and then has ignored them, and he says their biggest need is not deficit reduction or health care. It is good jobs. There is precious little discussion about jobs, creating jobs, giving jobs, making jobs in our political discourse today. Why is that? I will tell you why I think it is. I was just talking earlier to a young man who works at the Agency for International Development. I came to this town in May of 1962 to work as the assistant to the administrator of the Agency for International Development. And I came full of the enthusiasm that you have seen on the television, buried you on the television in the last few days about the Kennedy years. Whatever the revisionists say about Kennedy and whatever I say about Kennedy, and I say lots of bad things as my student can attest, the fact is that Kennedy did evoke an idealism and a will to service and a drive to serve our country. And it was a powerful one. And my sense then was that there were politicians in Washington. For all of the old barons in the Congress, there were politicians in Washington who were in touch with the people back home. And there wasn't all this money in politics that we have today. Today, to steal a phrase from the great Yugoslav writer Djilas, we have a new class in Washington made by this gigantic money, and it is a new political class. If you read your Washington Post today, you read that the polling firm headed by Stan Greenberg, the president's pollster, was paid $840,000 by the Democratic National Committee for the first 6 months of 1993. There was not money like that 30 years ago. There is a whole level of people. K Street was not K Street. K Street, they built all those buildings in the last 30 years, and they filled them up with lobbyists, rich lobbyists, or lobbyists for rich interests. You can go night after night in Washington if you choose to do so. I have a friend who does that. He courts young women, and he's a cheap guy. And he goes night after night and takes these young women to cocktail parties where they eat wonderful food. He never pays for it. He just goes from cocktail party to cocktail party because the new political class is whining and dining. Your representatives and mine, who has no vote, and all of those people live in a world in which nobody makes less than $100,000 a year, and in which they can't really imagine people who live on $35,000 a year, a family with 35. People ask me, why do I like to come out here to teach? Why have you given up life in Washington? I come out here because I see real people doing real jobs. I see real kids coming from real homes, and I do not see that political class. I have 23 miles west of my home. I am much more in touch with real America than I would be back there. And if I was back there, I'd have to dress like this every day, and God help me if I had to do that. I think that's a large part of it. Washington really has, in a substantial way, lost touch with ordinary people and with real work and real aspirations and with real human pain and with the anxieties of people whose hands are slipping away from the American dream. NAFTA laid all that out. NAFTA was in large measure about the safety of American capital in the global economy. Labor tried to force a debate to ask where the place of American labor was going to be in the global economy. There is a contempt for laboring people in this country. In the Washington Post again this week, a management consultant said of workers who talk about my job, he said, you know, they're wrong. It's not their job, it's the corporation's job. Well, in a real sense it is, but that is a different way to look at it and talk about it than we have talked about it before. And I myself am a lunch bucket Democrat who went to law school on the pay I earned in factories in Michigan carrying lunch buckets to work, and I do have a great and powerful sympathy with working people. I read in the New York Times a couple of years ago an American leader of an American corporation was asked, well, what about? You're running a global corporation, what about your loyalty to American workers? And this man said, for a quotation in the New York Times, well, loyalty to workers, you know, we do have workers in Chillicothe, but we also have to worry about our workers in Kuala Lumpur. They have as much claim to us and to our loyalties as the workers in Chillicothe. Well, now, in the post-NAFTA conversations, we're beginning to get people who are arguing that there need to be jobs programs. The great New York financier Felix Rohatyn, Hobart Rowan, the financial columnist for the Washington Post, Bob Herbert, columnist for the New York Times, Lester Thoreau, and others. Now, it seems to me, however, that the problem is deeper than a jobs program, though God knows we need a major jobs program as a stopgap. But with that many Americans slipping away from the American dream, with poor white women beginning to follow the same single mother poverty pattern that poor black women pioneered, in the lowest 30% of income levels, 40% of white women, are having babies out of wedlock and then moving into poverty and raising children without fathers. So it seems to me that we have a whole new national security problem in America. It's called protecting the standard of living, and therefore the core of our culture, protecting the core of our culture from deterioration and rot. It seems to me it requires a rethinking of work, how to share it, how to break it up, how to move toward barter, how to generate jobs over the long term, and to rethink the ways we use our national treasure. These things are not now on our national political agenda, but they must be. I have a friend named Bob Gale who was, until very recently, the president of the Association of Governing Boards of American universities and colleges, and Bob used to always say, we need a change of heart in America. And we do, because we need for people to become interested in that bottom 60%. We're not really an egalitarian nation, you know. This is a society based on privilege, always has been. Economic privilege, gender privilege, racial privilege. Our founders were all privileged men. We in our nation tend not to look back or look down. For very long, we look up. We aspire upward. The NAFTA debate was, as a matter of fact, described by some political analysts as Bill Clinton and the Democratic Party realigning itself so that it was aligned with winners and not with losers. The losers are those 60%. Aligning itself with winners. Don't look down, look up. Seems to me we as Americans need to think hard about what it is to be an American, what we owe to each other, what kinds of lives it is worthwhile to lead, whether market values are good values for human beings to live by, and indeed, whether they're good values for a nation to live by all the time. Clearly, my thinking has gone beyond cities now, and beyond race as well. Blacks were like the canaries in the mines, falling apart under unbearable economic pressure. Now, millions of whites are beginning to experience the dislocations created by globalization and deindustrialization. I think the NAFTA fight made a lot of white people understand it better. There's a fragment from a 60s civil rights song that talks about blacks and whites together. And perhaps that's the hope. Lots of blacks and lots of whites together are in that bottom 60%. In 1964, Senator Everett McKinley Dirksen of Illinois, the Republican leader in the Senate, said of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 it was an idea whose time had come. Perhaps because of the distress of that bottom 60%, black and white, perhaps the need of all able-bodied Americans for remunerative and meaningful work is a movement whose time has come. But if that is to come to fruition, human beings will have to make it so. It will not happen by itself. People have to say to themselves, I do not want to live in an America where 60% of the working people in the country lose ground, are disrespected, and the country becomes so bifurcated that the ordinary people are hurt so badly that they are open to the appeal of any Looney Tune guy who comes around with short quips, quirky answers, and an authoritarian personality. It's not the kind of country I want to live in. But Dr. Franklin, when he came out of the Constitutional Convention in the summer of 1787, was asked by a woman, well, what have you created in there, Dr. Franklin? He said, it's a republic if you can keep it. Well, it's up to us to keep it, it seems to me. Rich said, I haven't given up, and I don't. I do get weary sometimes. I do feel badly sometimes. People say, well, how can you keep going? I say, well, ancestor worship. People say, ancestor worship? I say, yeah. I say, I get weary. I get weary. I said, then I remember my ancestors. My father and his brother and his sister lost their own father, own mother in the winter of 1906 in St. Louis, Missouri, a segregated town. Their father was a ne'er-do-well. 1906, blacks didn't have any rights in this country. These children were grandchildren of illiterate slaves and sharecroppers. They were children at risk. You talk about children at risk. These children were children at risk. They could have grown up to be street people. My Aunt Armida could have been a prostitute. My father and his brother could have been criminals or... And then their mother's sister came and got them and took them to Minnesota, where they lived in the home of their uncle by marriage, Samuel Williams. By the world standards, Samuel Williams didn't have a great position. He was a servant on railroad trains. Dining car waiter. Called nigger, boy, George, anything else. Clean out spittoon, whatever the white people did, you had to smile and bow and scrape. But he had a job, Uncle Sam, had a job, went to that job every time the job was required for him to be there. And that job organized that family. There was discipline. There was hope. There was a connection with the economy. And those children went to the public schools of St. Paul, Minnesota, and then went to the public university, the University of Minnesota. The girl became a very, very popular student in the 20s before she died as a student. My father, you've heard of, a journalist who read Shakespeare. And the oldest child, Roy, became the head of the NAACP and was given the Medal of Freedom by President Johnson. All because Uncle Sam had a job. All because Uncle Sam took those children seriously, and that job of Uncle Sam's really was the bridge for the Wilkins family from illiterate slavery and sharecropperhood into the middle class. And before that, we had ancestors who never breathed a free breath in their life. They were born slaves and they died slaves. But somehow they held themselves together and tried for whatever dignity there could be. So I behave as if I'm going to meet those people someday. When I'm discouraged, I think about that. And I'll meet them someday, and they will look me in the eye and they'll say, boy, what did you do with your freedom? And I will say, I did the best I could to change things. It seems to me that the best I can do for my 60s dream, for Jim Lowry's 60s dream, is to fight as hard as I can for a movement that seeks to preserve and enhance the dignity, the welfare, and the work opportunities for ordinary working Americans in this maelstrom created by a global economy. It's the only way we're going to save our civilization. It's the only way we're going to save our cities. Thank you for inviting me tonight.